belt with tool C4162. Incidentally, there are 3 types of V-belts on the market: raw edge, wrapped, and laminated. Under some conditions, a raw edge belt will slip on the pump pulley if the belt gets wet. If this should happen on a car you're diagnosing, replace the raw edge belt with a wrapped or laminated belt. Here's something new. Remember, on past models, the lower end of the steering shaft had to be centered in the coupling with the gauge hole 13/16 of an inch above the end of the coupling? Well, with the exception of the Plymouth Barracuda and the Dodge Challenger, this has been changed for 1974. The column is no longer adjustable. But look at the column mounting under the dash. The bracket is mounted on a plastic attaching plate. If the bracket should happen to move on the attaching plate, it may set up a preloading condition on the worm shaft and create a heavy torque condition during right turns and poor return from left turns. For reference, the edge of the plastic should be flush with the edge of the bracket nearest the driver. If it's not flush, pull the column up until it is and tighten the nuts. Okay, let's see if the control valve body is centered on the steering chuck. Start the engine. Did you see that? Turn the car off and start it again. See, the wheel jumps to the right when you start the engine and turn it off again. That means you have to center the valve body. That's right. Loosen the hold-down screws. Now, take a hammer. Hey, wait a minute. You're just going to do a little tapping, not beat it into a new shape. That's better. Now, remember, don't hammer on the valve body. Tap on the end of the plug or the valve body end screws. Now, wait a minute. Did you retighten the hold-down screws? If you don't do that, when you start the engine and the pressure starts to build, you'll blow the O-rings between the valve body and gear housing assembly. Now the valve is centered. Take it for a test drive. How did it go? Wanders, huh? Looks like the sector shaft needs adjusting. Did you disconnect the center link from the steering gear arm? Is the steering shaft centered? Good. Start the engine. Now, adjust the screw until the backlash disappears. Then continue to tighten it 3/8 to a half turn more and tighten the lock nut. Incidentally, if the steering wheel isn't centered, you can center it by adjusting the tie rod ends. Okay, let's say it looks like the problem is in the gear assembly. Hold on. For certain types of problems, you don't take out the gear until you've tried replacing the valve assembly first. See the reference book for details. If the new valve assembly doesn't do it, then remove the steering gear. Let's get into the steering gear and some of the problems you may find. One of the most obvious problems is there are 2 different steering gear assemblies available, and there's always the chance of using the wrong one. So someone came up with a way to tell them apart. Here's the chuck for full-size cars. First, you'll notice a large letter C, which is cast onto the side of the housing. Next, All C-body chucks built after January 1973 will have a machined groove in the housing head. It's important to make sure a grooved housing head is used with a C housing. We'll get into the reason why as soon as we get these two units apart. This chuck is used on compact and intermediate-sized cars. It does not have a C cast on the side of the housing, and the housing head does not have a groove. Okay, let's look at the cutaway model and identify some parts. Remember these names: worm shaft seal, reaction assembly, pivot lever, steering valve, and power piston. Here's the sector shaft side of the chuck. This is the sector shaft seal, and because this is a full-size car chuck, it has needle bearings. Okay, let's take them apart. The whole works is like a puzzle, and the sector shaft is the key piece. You have to take it out before you can get the rest of it apart. Okay, this is a chuck for full-size cars, so you have to be careful when you take the sector shaft out. Otherwise, the needle bearings will fall out. Can we do this one over? Okay. Okay, this is a chuck for full-size cars, so you have to be careful when you take the sector shaft out, otherwise the needle bearings will fall out. Pull the shaft out until it clears the top of the bore and turn it 90 degrees. This will keep the bearings in place and the sector shaft teeth are clear of the power piston teeth. Take off the valve assembly. Remove the housing nut and take out the pivot lever. Now the works are free to come out. Put a screwdriver in the piston teeth and give it a push. Here's something a lot of people look at and say, uh-oh, the bore is scored. It's not scored. These marks are made by the cutting tool during manufacturing. The Teflon piston ring expands and conforms to the bore and prevents leakage. While we're on the subject of piston rings, if the Teflon is in good shape, not cracked or cut, or if you haven't removed it from the piston, you really don't have to replace it. If, however, it's damaged, you'll have to replace it with the cast iron ring from the rebuilding kit. See the reference book for details. There are two major points to remember when you're rebuilding steering gear chucks. First, get the seals where they belong. As you can see, some of the seals are almost the same size. You have to be very careful when you're replacing them, or you'll get them mixed up, especially the sector shaft cover and the seals in the valve body area. Next, there's an internal difference between the chucks used for full-size cars and the smaller cars. The obvious difference is here in the reaction rings, seals, and O-rings. The reaction rings for the full-size cars have a smaller flange width than those used for the smaller cars. The flange width on reaction rings for C-body units is 61 thousandths of an inch. The housing head groove is 165 thousandths of an inch wide. The other type units have reaction rings which are 105 thousandths wide and a housing head groove which is 210 thousandths of an inch wide. If you get the two mixed up, you'll find yourself in deep trouble. You'll cut the seals and you won't really understand why. Okay, let's put it back together. A lot of people run into trouble here with the reaction springs. Now, the reaction spring goes over the reaction ring. The outside diameter of the reaction ring is slightly smaller than the inside diameter of the spring. Okay, wind the worm shaft into the piston and shove it into the housing without letting it unwind. It sounds like a three-handed operation, but it's not. It just takes a little practice. When you're reassembling a gear, make sure you use a tab washer, even though the unit you took apart didn't have one. It keeps the powertrain from turning and prevents a cocked valve lever. Put the lever in and make sure it's seated in the center race by tapping on it lightly. The most important thing is to make sure the slot is positioned so it runs in the same direction as the worm shaft. When you put the valve lever back in, make sure you get the spring in right. You'll have to work at it to get it in wrong, but it has happened. Well, it's just about all back together. A few points to remember. Keep it clean. A dirty work area can undo all your hard work. And don't use automatic transmission fluid to refill the pump with. How come? It eats up the hoses from the inside out. Read the reference book. You'll get the whole story, plus some things we didn't have time for in this film.